You can't preach justice on Sunday and then practice patriarchy and hierarchy and totalitarianism on Monday and hope that people are going to believe what you say.
In this episode, we're going to have a conversation with Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty. We're going to be talking about some really critical issues like Christian liberty and freedom, fundamentalism and the threats that it poses, as well as just issues of Baptist life and Presbyterian life and what it means to teach at a seminary in this time when people aren't going to churches and pastors are struggling to figure out what's next in ministry. So it's a wide-ranging conversation, and I was really excited to have Elizabeth on the program. She's a professor at Union Presbyterian Seminary in North Carolina, and she's also author of the brand new book, Authentic Christian Freedom, Deconstructing the American Gospel of Liberty. And we'll be talking about all of that in this episode. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I do want to let you know that I have a book coming out. Officially releases October 7th, but it's already available for pre-orders wherever you order your books. The Bible According to Christian Nationalists, Exploiting Scripture for Political Power. Looks at various ways that the Bible is misused by Christian nationalists, including fundamentals that we'll be talking about in this conversation. And so I encourage you to grab your copy of this book today. It will really help you out as we're dealing with this unique and troubling moment in American political life and in American church life. And now, here's my conversation with Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty, author of Authentic Christian Freedom. Well, Elizabeth, first of all, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to have you here to talk about a lot of different things. And we're going to be really thinking about some issues of religious freedom and liberty and of conscience and some of our shared Baptist roots. And so I want to kind of talk about that because for some of our Baptist listeners, they might recognize your last name. And so let's talk a little bit about your story because it's something that you've been writing about and how that has impacted your conception of thinking about these big, weighty issues.
Oh, sure. And honestly, I'm glad you picked up on that because a lot of people don't recognize my last name in connection with my Baptist roots, which is funny. I don't know if it's the hyphenator thing or something else, but I appreciate your picking up on that. During the last election, when I was listening to speeches that were given both by Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, I started thinking about this theme of freedom. And I started a study group, and it was a group to, work through creating the manuscript, think about distinctions between freedom from, freedom to, freedom for that I use in the book. And one of the members of that study group, she asked me, she said, I really think readers are going to want to know why this is so important to you. What is it why are you personally interested in these questions of freedom? And so I sat with that and I wondered for a while as a writer, should I really go into my personal story again? And then I realized I probably couldn't really write this book without telling some of the personal story. And it struck me how much of my life, particularly early on, was lived on the front line of the country culture wars. And even as a child, going to the Southern Baptist Convention and walking in and seeing, this debate about the core nations of our institution, the church, protections of reproductive rights for women, questions within the church about public education and the role it should play, all playing out, in these debates in front of me. And I didn't let it sink in for a really long time. And then as I was writing, I realized that also much of my father's work really began with questions of freedom and liberty and how much they are the core of Baptist tradition, and how he felt early on that Baptists had really betrayed their understanding of freedom and liberty. And so I started grappling with, well, what does that mean for me now as, became a Presbyterian, now living into that identity. But how am I also still incorporating, my dad used to have this saying about his own kind of religious self. He was Bapto, Presbyterio, Catholico, Buddhisto. I can't remember how his saying continued, but how do I live into that ecumenical identity that's really part at the core of who I am, and think about freedom, which is so much a part of the political debate today.
Yeah, and as you know, I mean, that's literally where you open your book, and I do think it adds so much to the story of recognizing what your family was going through during your formative years growing up. You know, the 80s for Southern Baptists were dealing with all of these big issues that we're seeing on a much broader national scale now, but it was kind of prefiguring and largely the takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention to help make the politics of today possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I realized in reviewing that history, excuse me, and I include some of that history in the book. One of the major takeaways for me as I reviewed the history was that it was always told to me and experienced in my young life as a narrative between conservative, fundamentalist Christians and more progressive or liberal Southern Baptists or mainline Christians. And I discovered as I began to really think about the freedom struggle and its meaning for authentic Christian freedom today, that I had also been told primarily a story of white Christian America, and that I needed to expand much beyond a more kind of superficial reading of that history, where I was content with that, I think, for a little while, even though I'm hesitant to admit that. But I want to be honest about that, because I think I was content with that reading of the history, and then realized I really had to challenge myself to dig deeper. That, the story of freedom and the kind of idea of freedom in our nation has always had a more diverse, rich, human and planet-centered understanding than we've allowed to be part of the discourse within mainline denominations. And so that was really something that was a new awareness that challenged me a lot, remembering that history.
And I want to know, just for those that aren't familiar with your father, Glenn Hinson, who passed away at the beginning of this year, and so condolences on that. An influential Baptist historian, and yet who also found himself living, ironically, at the center of a lot of significant Baptist history at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, as everything was shifting there, leading eventually to the Al Mohler regime that we still have going on and impacting Republican politics today, as well as the Southern Baptist more broadly. What was it watching that personally? Because I mean, you've also now kind of in some ways followed into his footsteps. And we'll get to your trajectory in a moment. As an academic and teaching at Christian school, so in many ways you followed, but you also this is something that impacts you differently than if you're just reading about someone else. This was your family.
Yeah. Well, my family had a kind of, I would say this was a social problem that really is important to recognize, in that in my household when I was growing up, the two topics that we never avoided were religion and politics. It didn't matter what day of the week it was. It didn't matter who was coming to dinner. That was front and center in our family, dialogue. And I tell this story in the book about the first time my husband comes to dinner, and we were seminary students together. And he had never met my parents, and my mother invited him to sit down at the table. My husband is from the South, and so a little bit more formal in the way that he interacted with people than my family and the way in which we interacted around the dinner table. And my mother looked at him in the eyes and she said, "Lee, there's only one F word that we don't say at the dinner table." And he looked shocked. And so then she said, "It's not a 4-letter word, Lee. It's fundamentalist." And, she really emphasized that. There's just no way that you can live in the midst of what was going on at Southern Seminary, at the Southern Baptist Convention, with the kind of stature my dad was able to live into and to build in the international community and in the United States without really being affected by that. And I'll be honest, there's some positive and negative impacts. And one of the really positive impacts is that I think I'm still a straight talker and I really cannot live with injustice. And so I'll call people to task. I do think that's positive, even though it's hard. But I think one of the negative impacts is there's still so much woundedness in the Baptist community, in mainline denominations, even in my own family around that history, because it takes you away from so many things. A lot of people, and this is a little bit more personal than the book, but a lot of people have this epic memory of my dad. And I love that. I love to talk to his students and to other religious leaders and that kind of things. But because he had such an impact, it also meant that he wasn't always at home. And so it's a different way of relating to a parent. And much of the tenderness and the kind of intimacy in our relationship came when he was dying, kind of very, very much toward the end of his life. And so it forms your relationship and who you are and how you even relate to your family in very different ways.
So as you already alluded in our conversation, you're Presbyterian and you teach at Union Presbyterian Seminary in North Carolina.
Yes.
So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that journey for you, and then also we could talk about what you're teaching.
Yeah, that has been a beautiful journey. Union Presbyterian Seminary is where I did my graduate work, and I was hired to teach on our Charlotte campus, which is trying some really new and innovative ways of engaging in theological education. And the part of the beauty of this particular area is it's a very strong kind of influence of Presbyterians, Baptists as well, actually. But there's a lot of interest in the local community and really strong, vibrant churches at Union. I think, and I hope as viewers listen to this, that, they called me there because of a lot of the kind of different aspects of my work in ethics and in theology, and have been working in economic ethics. One of my early books was called The Problem of Wealth. And it emerged from my participation as a research consultant for the World Council of Churches and looking at the root causes of wealth inequality, poverty, and environmental devastation worldwide. Charlotte's a huge banking town. And so one of the first classes that I offered was called More Than Money, Math, and Markets, which was a great deal of fun to teach. And part of the premise of the class, I had a number of people in the class there in our program. It's called the Master of Arts in Public Theology. And these are bankers that are working in the industry in different kind of capacities and roles. And they wanted to take the class to learn the language of theology. And I said, hey, this is really interesting. So why don't you bring the language from your experience in the banking industry? And we really got in some rich and fabulous conversations in that pushed us in different ways. I also teach disability theologies there, which emerged from some of the work I did in Dutiful Love, which also tells a little bit of my family story. But I guess more significantly is influenced by my teaching at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College, which was a college originally designed to be accessible for people with disabilities, primarily physical disabilities, and all the questions that it raised for me early on. And coming up this semester, I'm going to teach ethics, which is a great deal of fun. I ground it in a very Hinson way, which is using and drawing upon the ecumenical movement and strategies of immersion experiences, contextual kind of interpretation. And I was really excited about teaching that class. And we'll see what else the students want me to do. I was affected by this approach to writing and teaching that my dad always had. And that was the best books emerge from student questions. And the questions that are difficult for you to answer in class, those are the questions you should pursue in your writing. And so a lot of my projects, that's really how they've come about, and we'll see what the students bring this year.
Well, so that may be a great segue, because I want to talk, more deeply about authentic Christian freedom, deconstructing the American gospel of liberty. So what were some of the questions that led to that project?
Gosh, there were so many that have emerged in classes since I've been at Union. And one of the key questions was, serving in a pastoral role, how do I deal with navigating the purple church, or this, concept that has become very influential in congregations to maintain a kind of civil peace between Republicans and Democrats while we're living through this present kind of historical moment. And so the last chapter in the book really is directed toward that. What are some strategies that we can do to engage in authentic dialogue? For me, when I teach ethics, I draw upon the work of Ellen Ott Marshall, who wrote an introduction to Christian ethics. She's a professor at Candler School of Theology. She also works in conflict transformation. And, one of the claims that she makes is to be Christian is to be in conflict. And so if you're willing to make that claim and you understand that it's an essential part of Christian identity, then maintaining the civil peace isn't the primary role that leadership would play in Christian community. So how do we engage in really rich, challenging dialogue? And, one of the things I learned in writing that chapter and from writing the book, again, at the encouragement of the study group that I worked with as they were reading it and challenging me with different ideas, was really that we have to also convict ourselves that we can't begin from a place, even as religious leaders, that we are the experts in the room at defining freedom. We may be the experts in helping to facilitate and invite the conversation and provide the resources from which we can collectively determine the meaning of authentic Christian freedom today. And that really helped me shift kind of the voice of that chapter, and also shift in some ways my understanding of what is authentic Christian freedom. That's freedom for pastors. It can mean a lot. Like if you want to preach justice, maybe the sermon isn't just adversarial or confrontational. It might be invitational. That this is a conversation that we have to engage in. And I was very much steeped in that tradition early on, that prophetic preaching is also confrontational preaching, adversarial preaching. And that's been a challenge too, and a fun challenge in some ways, and a continuation of a journey, I guess, earlier when I was thinking about an approach to leadership in congregational context.
Yeah, and throughout the idea of the Exodus is figured heavily in your work, and thinking about, and rethinking about, reframing and deconstructing, as you put it in the subtitle, these concepts of liberty and freedom. So I wonder if you can give us a little taste of that as well, because I think that's really important to get the theological grounding.
So, the Exodus story, I realized in reading some of what historians call the reception history, is a kind of double-edged sword, because it depends on if you read the story through the vanquished or through the lens of the conquerors, the people that are triumphant. And a lot of Christian theology really focuses on reading the story through the lens of the conquerors, or those who are triumphant, regardless of their theological or political affiliation. And I realized,
always in seeing ourselves as the conquerors, like always putting ourselves in that position.
That we are experiencing liberation, that we are on the side of the oppressed, that the promised land is for us. That's our narrative and that's our destiny, all those things. So I realized that contemporary scholarship really is challenging that understanding and reading of the Exodus story, for a number of different reasons. And one of the reasons has to do with the experience of indigenous peoples and how, the idea of entering into Canaan and the experience of the promised land, for the Israelites, what that conveys to indigenous people. Another big reason is that, many scholars are emphasizing that the Exodus story has been read through the story of Joshua. And, this kind of idea that we're going to defeat people in, a major kind of battle, that represents a kind of sense of spiritual warfare, that God is on our side, and then we'll be able to experience God's blessings and be prosperous in the land that God originally intended for us. Kate Common, who is a professor that teaches at Methodist Theological School of Ohio, she's written a wonderful book. It's called Undoing Conquest. And in it, she highlights some contemporary research on the Highland settlements, that if we really read the Exodus story as it was told within its historical context, that the Israelites could have settled in an area where they lived in peace and in community with other people, as opposed to reading that story with a kind of sense of their own, the creation of their own nation state that they would defend. In the story, God is very much on their side, even in the midst of a peaceful settlement. And in the midst of their experience. But for God to be on their side means that God is present in the midst of their daily struggle, and also helping to provide for their daily sustenance, and embracing their creation in God's image, as opposed to sending them out to battle to ensure prosperity and a unique kind of nation state national identity.
So, you're working on this book and fleshing out these ideas, particularly during a contentious election, and you're thinking about, how can we be a purple church and cross these partisan lines. And then, of course, I know how this goes. You finish the book and then you have to wait for it to come out eventually. And a lot of things have happened, since the time that you turned in the manuscript and the book came out. And then obviously even since the book has come out now for a month or two, that more stuff continues to happen. If you were working on this idea now, like what more do you feel like, needs to be said for the moment in which we find ourselves in, where, even, houses of worship are finding themselves targeted in ICE arrests, and we're seeing, criticisms and, threats against preachers for speaking out against, on various issues, even simple things like Bishop Buddy at the Washington Cathedral, just simply asking for mercy, right, in a very pastoral, kind voice, and then getting, widely criticized, and, suggestions that the government take over the Washington Cathedral and that she be deported, even though she was born in New Jersey. I mean, all sorts of like crazy ideas coming from like serious people in Congress. Mm-hmm. So like, what's in this moment as you've been thinking about all these issues? Like, it feels like the temperature has raised even more dramatically than when you were writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think that if I were going to add an additional chapter, and maybe it's something that I should take on in another way, I think that I would definitely add a chapter that more clearly emphasizes the connection between immigration issues and freedom. I think that is a chapter of its own, and how that really feeds into this culture war and the struggle of people in the midst of this era of mass deportation. I also think that another chapter should be devoted to Israel-Palestine, and what's the relevance of this conversation for the experience of people in Gaza, and the kind of tragedy that the world is witnessing unfold. I think there's so much that could be continued to explore in terms of a tradition of protest. And, what are the ways that we exercise our freedoms that also can really impact change that is necessary with a sense of greater immediacy. I think there's a lot of questions there. And I will tell you that I have another book I'm working on that is sort of in some subtle ways related to this project, but it has to do with the President of the United States presumed freedom of taking a role and living in a role as a kind of charismatic leader that we simply should trust without any kind of interrogation of the ideas, really any kind of understanding of the arguments, and not a real affirmation that we also might have a profound vision for the United States that we think is critical for us to live into today. And I'm titling that project Courageous Moral Leadership from Common People, as a kind of emphasis on the kind of sense that, we all can live into and help people understand the importance of the freedom to live in self-giving love for the sake of others. And maybe the most authoritative moral leaders that we need to be paying attention to are those who have not ever entered into formal positions of authority or power, because they're offering a counter narrative through their own story and by emphasizing, the importance of basic common care, of local community, of providing for other people's needs. We recently heard the story of a family that saved just a small amount of money, and it was part of an annuity. And when it matured, instead of keeping that for their own family, used it to establish a habitat house. And just this kind of tremendous support for the family that really was counter to what most common advice or common sense would say in our nation. So what does that courageous moral leadership look like?
And so obviously, as we're wrapping up here, this is something, of course, you're trying to teach, the next generation of, church leaders and so forth. And I mean, it's an unusual and difficult time for our nation politically and morally, but it's also an unusual and difficult time in church life. I mean, this is as well as, probably, and maybe I'm sure better than our listeners, but this isn't a surprise to anyone that like churches are in decline, church attendance is on decline. How are you helping the next kind of generation think about what does it look like to be the church, to lead a church in this era, which is very different from the one that, not only that you grew up in, but it's very different than what your father was preparing the next generation of pastors to go into.
Yeah. Isn't that the question of the day for most denominations?
So I just need you to answer it here for us all, and then we'll have it all fixed.
I'll see if I can come up with a good, really thoughtful response there. And one observation I want to make is, and I referenced this very briefly in the book, but Diana Butler Bass has posted on her blog site some studies that show that mainline decline has stabilized. And so I think one important thing that mainline denominations can do is really, challenge the narrative that we are in decline. And part of my own approach in the academy, and I think in the church, is to emphasize much more the importance of sustainability than perhaps my father's generation would have emphasized growth, that what we really need to do is grow. And I think the big challenge for me at the moment, particularly in preparing students, is helping them figure out where they can identify that people who are interested in conversations about Christian ethics and a vision of living in the world that reflects Christian values, really where they can go to find the places where those people are congregating at the present time. And maybe it's not just inside the walls of particular church buildings, but it could be here in Charlotte. I live very close to the People's Market. That might be a place. It could be in protests. One of my colleagues at the seminary worked together with us to create an event where we went to the Pride Parade to talk about the importance of the ministry of the seminary and what we're trying to accomplish, seeking justice in the world, and really to live authentically according to our values. And strangely, I'll tell you, in some ways that's different than the past generation, but I remember my dad telling me a story about how he learned to preach at Southern Baptist Seminary. And I don't know if this is a story that you'll be aware of, but what they used to do, if my memory is correct, somebody can check me on this if it's not. But what I understand they used to do is they used to go down on the street corner in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, and they had to preach a short sermon so that they could learn how to communicate their ideas to anyone passing by. Wasn't necessarily about conversion or evangelism at the moment, but it was about communication. And I think for my students today, that's one of the things I always try to emphasize is how are you understanding the audience for what you want to say? And how are you communicating your beliefs and your values? And most importantly, how are you embodying them? How are you living into them? Because, you can't preach justice on Sunday and then practice patriarchy and hierarchy and totalitarianism on Monday and hope that people are going to believe what you say. So I think that's part of the challenge for churches today, is to really embody that kind of sense of authenticity in their life and work and go to where the people are.
I think it's a great word, and it's a really good note for us to end on. The book is Authentic Christian Freedom: Deconstructing the American Gospel of Liberty. I hope people will check it out. And Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us, and even more so for your work you're doing and helping us think and grapple with some really important issues.
Thank you so much. So good to talk with you.